Hi, I'm Andrew Rich, and if you're like me, you look at the state of modern wrestling discourse and think, wow, what a cesspool. That's why I'm here to tell you about Music of the Mat Remix. That's right, your favorite wrestling music podcast is back with a new format, where I bring on a guest and we play songs related to wrestling-themed topics. It could be a wrestling reference, a wrestling concept, a wrestling pun, things of that nature. Now you might be saying, Andrew, that is a very, very tenuous connection to pro wrestling on a wrestling podcast network. Is this just an excuse to hang out with your friends and talk about music and ignore the rest of the wrestling landscape? Yes. Yes, it is. So listen to Music of the Mat Remix on the Voices of Wrestling Podcast Network, available on Apple, Spotify, or your podcast player of choice.
Hello, do you like New Japan Pro Wrestling? Are you a Shin Nihon freak? If so, check out the Super J-Cast with Joel and Damon on the Voices of Wrestling Podcast Network.
And even if you fucking hate New Japan Pro Wrestling, listen to the Super J-Cast anyway. Not just for our great show reviews, analysis, and pastrami sandwiches, but there's also usually some dick jokes somewhere in the obligatory opening 30 minutes of absolute nonsense we chat about every single week. That's the Super J-Cast for all the best talk about New Japan Pro Wrestling, crisps, and pornography.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Gentleman's Wrestling Podcast. I'm your host, as always, Jesse Collings, and joining me once again, he's a returning guest on the show. He's one of our favorite guests, and I know this is probably the only time in his life anyone has ever described him as one of their favorites. He is our British Columbia correspondent. It is Trevor Dame, host of the ThROH The Years ROH Retrospective Podcast. How are you doing today, Trevor?
I'm not even my own favorite at anything. So that's quite the unbelievable compliment, but I will accept it, not graciously, because I just doubted it. But yes, it is hot in the BC. And how are you doing, Jesse? It's always a pleasure to be on.
Yeah, well, there was a discussion at Gentleman's Wrestling Podcast headquarters in our offices earlier today. A lot of people in the office where we were ranking our favorite reoccurring Canadian guests, and you were in the top 10. So I think that's a good spot for you.
Yeah, absolutely. I've got to be here and remind people what it takes, to. I can't even pretend to. I'm sorry. I couldn't even finish that. But I will do my best.
I do always, of course, appreciate your form of self-deprecation humor as a practitioner of it myself.
Mm-hmm.
I was eating ice cream earlier today, and my roommate was like, "Oh, you got some ice cream?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm doing this podcast with this guy later, and he just really fucking sucks, and I just got to put myself in as good of a mood as possible just to get through it." And she's like, "Oh, why are you having a podcast with them?" I'm like, It's complicated."
That doesn't really feel like self-deprecating. That feels more like me deprecating.
No, you're supposed to laugh about it. Oh yeah, I do fucking suck. That was the self-deprecating part on your end.
Okay, well,
That wasn't self-deprecating. That was just mean.
exactly. That was cruel, and I enjoyed this episode. It'll be the last time I'm on. So that's a joke. That's a joke.
Hey, we don't know how this episode is gonna go. You could say some cancelable stuff, and you'd be out of here. But Trevor's on because I wanted to talk about AEW and really some big picture stuff as we get set for All In this weekend. We're recording this on a Wednesday evening. I've got Dynamite on in the background. I can tell you exactly what's happening right now. We're getting a video package for Kenny Omega versus Kazuchika Okada, which has been a very highly demanded video package for these two guys by certain corners of the wrestling universe. But I want to focus on, I guess, essentially what has gone right for AEW in 2025 and kind of how we've gotten to this point where it seems like we're having pretty much every television episode is getting really good reviews, and we've had some exciting, very good pay-per-views, and we're setting up for their biggest show they've ever had in the United States. The only show that they've ever had that's going to draw a bigger audience is the two shows at Wembley Stadium. And how did AEW kind of get here? Because if we were having this conversation last year, or we were having this conversation, 18 to 24 months ago, it wouldn't necessarily be, oh, look how great AEW is doing in conversation. There have been some real problems that the company has been able to kind of, I think, overcome. And I wanted to kind of go over kind of what has gone right in 2025 with you, Trevor, because I do think you're a pretty good big picture guy, and you're obviously very observant of some of the broader trends that kind of, I think, impact a wrestling company beyond just, you know, raging at certain match results, or the way a lot of people seem to do wrestling punditry these days.
Yeah, I've been known to observe some wrestling, but yeah, it's you know what the interesting thing is, and this is not a great way to start the podcast. A lot of the reasons why I feel like AEW's done better this year are kind of boring in the sense of it's just been very nuts and bolts. It's been consistently just building, like I was talking about this on Twitter the other day. Like compare this, you were talking about, where they started to go wrong maybe a couple of years ago. Compare this all-in build to the first the all-in build 2 years ago, where even though that was like the biggest show of in some ways all time, that show was filled with matches that didn't have good builds, that felt kind of sloppily thrown together, haphazard. That, like, if you look at that card now to 2023's All In, it does not feel like a card befitting a wrestling event that set like the indoor attendance record. It just doesn't. Where this year, um, on the night of the Double or Nothing pay-per-view, by the end of that show, the pay-per-view before All In, 2 months out, you knew what the top three matches were. Two of them were already on the books, and everyone basically knew Okada Omega was happening. So you knew what the top three matches were. And, I think this year is full of simple things like that, where, they always had the talent, they had the horses. A lot of times they got distracted, the weird crisis happened. And I think just a lot of things like that, where it is just a company that this is probably like the best stretch they've just had of just keeping their eye on the ball, their head down, and doing the million simple things a wrestling company should do just to feel stable and building maybe a little bit of momentum.
Yeah, when I think about what has gone right this year, there are a number of things, but the first thing that I really want to focus on is I think that this is the best the AEW roster has ever been utilized. You could make a case it's the strongest the roster has ever been from a personnel and from a health perspective. But one of the things I think has been really attributable to a kind of company-wide turnaround in 2025 is, I think, a really strong focus on the best people that they could possibly have for building a company, not only for the present, but also for the future. The
I
first
think.
serve,
Oh, so,
no, go
go
ahead.
on. Oh, I thought you were done. I was just going to say, yeah, I think, it's still somewhat of a problem for them of too many overstuffed people, but I think this year they've definitely gotten better at feeling like you see certain people on Dynamite every week and you kind of
Exactly.
know who the top stars are. Like, it's not this, there's still a rotating cast underneath, and maybe if you have favorites, that aren't being the top push people, you feel like, oh, they still disappear. I don't see them as much as I should. But in that core group of main eventers, it feels like now you watch Dynamite week in and week out for the last few months, and you know who the top stars are.
Yes, that's a key point and one of the ones I'm kind of getting at. And I think the first several years of AEW, when you think about like the roster in general, it really is a complicated, messy kind of system where you have the original roster where the company first starts. Then you're just kind of acquiring all of these ex-WWE talent that is getting released, or they're letting their contract run down and they make the jump. Some of them were great additions, some of them were not good additions. And it took a while to kind of figure out who the right people were, who the wrong people were. You're also kind of pushing some people because you're like, oh, this person's a young wrestler, so let's try to push them because we believe in them. But then maybe that person didn't really take off, and now you kind of are stuck with this person you've kind of invested in, but you feel like you have to keep pushing them on television. But other people have kind of come in, and you have suspensions, and you have injuries, and you have all of this stuff happen, and I think we get to the point now when you look at who's going to be on this all-in card and you kind of look at who has been carrying the television for the last several months. It is not, like I said, it's a smaller group in a lot of ways than in the past, but it's also a more logical, more sensible group from a lot of for a lot of different reasons. And you don't have this kind of, I would say it's more defined would be the best way. You have your clear top guys, you have your mid carders, you have your younger wrestlers underneath, and then you kind of have your cannon fodder wrestlers who are losing on television a lot. And it seems a lot healthier and a lot easier for the audience to understand that. And something I've really focused on as a wrestling fan this year, not intentionally, but just kind of something that I feel like has something that's gotten more and more of my attention, especially when I think about certain wrestling promotions like AEW and like New Japan Pro Wrestling, is having like dead weight on your roster, having people on your roster that are not really contributing in a significant way and taking up time and opportunity from other people who could be contributing in a greater way. And this somewhat leaner version of featured talent in AEW is, I think, really short on dead weight. And at the start of this year, I was a little concerned about how many older wrestlers were being featured, right? We had Chris Jericho, of course. We had Jeff Jarrett was on television a lot. Christopher Daniels, although I liked his angle with Hangman Page, was working this angle with Hangman Page. You had Dustin Rhodes. You just seem to have like all these guys that are in their 50s, and it's like, what, and of course you had Adam Copeland and Christian. So it's like, what is this promotion? Like, is it the young, exciting promotion, or is it the WWE retirement home promotion? And in a vacuum, I can say, oh, I like these individual performers on an individual basis. But when it came to just looking at the cards and looking at the show, it's like, is this a thriving young growing wrestling promotion, or is this like a nostalgia promotion uh, for wrestlers who are on the tail ends of their career? And I think since the start of this year, as we now sit here in July of 2025, we've seen a total change. And this feels like a roster dedicated towards, like I said, not only the present, but the future as well.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and it's one thing that makes me a little scared when you know Copeland and Jericho will probably eventually be coming back, and they will be used in some roles of prominence probably. And I don't think it's a complete coincidence. I think it's far from the only reason, but I don't think it's a complete coincidence that kind of this continued upswing has kind of coincided with those guys being gone, and that allowing you to lavish more resources on other people that are a little bit younger, fresher. And one thing AW I think has done, which I was calling for a long time ago, was when I talked about, focusing on fewer stars. I was thinking you have a really good core for here. And I think in the last few months of TV, they have largely focused on those guys, made them feel, I'll say them in a second, made them feel like top of the card names that always get some attention. And those guys would be Adam Page, MJF, this is in no real order, Swerve Strickland, and Will Ospreay. And I think the things they have in common is they all feel like they belong to AEW. Like you could say, okay, Ospreay had a long career before AEW, but this was the first company in the major company in the US he signed with, and he's done really good work already and really found a role quickly here. Page is an AEW day one guy. MJF is an AEW, guy that feels like, this was his first major promotion of national prominence. And Swerve, even you could say, okay, he's WWE, but to me, Swerve feels like an AEW guy in the sense of he is the absolute best case scenario you could possibly have. I think the greatest success story you could ever have of signing a guy from WWE, of a, an example of a guy who just did not take this as a demotion, had like a chip on his shoulder and worked his butt off to work here, became a very vocal flag bearer for AEW, and has just kind of proven that he was not fully utilized, close to fully utilized in WWE. And those guys, they all have another very important thing in common, which is I believe their age range is 29 to 34. So even on the upper end of that, you'd think, knock on wood, guys don't get hurt. They have at least 5 years in them of like prime, don't have to worry about them physically, hopefully. And in modern wrestling, that's a baby, 29 to 34. And I think when you look at what WWE, so many of the guys they're pushing right now on top, that's that I think that's a great distinction you want to have. You want to have that comparison point of, and I know Moxley's there as world champ right now, and I know you've got guys like Omega's in the mix, guys like that, and they should be in the main event mix. But to me, those core four should be the guys that they're always doing something really important. And then all your other big names, including your veterans of the past, whether it be Omega, Moxley, when you bring in Coper, Jericho, whatever, those guys can kind of float in and out. But to me, when I talk about like wanting to put four guys on a tier above everyone else, those are the four. And I guess for women, I think they've done a good job of Toni Storm and Mercedes feel like they're on a tier above everyone else in the division. I think ideally you'd want to turn that top two into kind of the female core four. I think right now it feels like two women that are way on top of everybody else, which isn't the worst thing. I mean, they're the champions, but I think ideally you would want a couple other people to kind of separate, to be booked in a way that separates them from the pack, because right now you have a lot of really talented women, but it feels like Mercedes and Tony are on one tier, and then there's like a 12-person middle tier below, way below them, that's kind of muddled. But overall, I think they've done a good job the last few months of kind of picking the right people and then making them feel like they are the core of this promotion.
Yeah, I think when the company first started, you naturally are going to rely on people with established star power, which, because your company has no history, is going to be people who have star power from other promotions. And I would say that from the first day of the company, your top four male singles acts are Chris Jericho, Jon Moxley, Cody Rhodes, and Kenny Omega. And that's all because those guys are coming from other companies, mainly WWE, but also, New Japan and things like that with Kenny. But over time, that was, 6 years ago. Now you're looking at who is going to be that next inheritant generation. And right when the company started, right, they came up with their whole four pillars gimmick, where we're going to pick four guys in their 20s, and those guys are going to be the future of our company, in MJF, Sammy Guevara, Jack Perry, and Darby Allin. And I always said that was a mistake to kind of label those guys as the four pillars. It made it seem like they were all going to be kind of in a rivalry with one another when they were so young and so raw that we didn't know how they were actually going to develop and whether or not they would all end up becoming main event acts. I think we've gotten an answer to that question over the last 6 years. And that answer is that certainly in Jack Perry and Sammy Guevara's case, that's not happening. But what has the company done, especially over the last year or so, is that they've really pivoted towards, okay, we do have our next four top guys. Their time is now. And it's going to be Swerve, Will Ospreay, MJF, who's one of those four pillars, and Hangman Page, who was kind of in the gap between established top guy when the company first started, and young and guy on the come up. Yeah. But one of the big things for Tony was that he was not married to the idea of, we got to push Jack Perry, we got to push Sammy Guevara at any cost because those are the guys I picked. We had years and years to find out who was going to stand out from that younger crop, who was going to become available like a Will Ospreay, and we're going to make sure that those decision we make is going to be the best for who's the best right now, and not being married to an original idea, which was a concern that I had kind of a few years ago, that Tony was going to be married to his ideas and wouldn't be able to pivot to who the best person actually ends up being, not just who he wanted to be the top guys when he started the company 6 years ago.
Yeah, and I want to just make clear, I don't think there's anything wrong with the people they focused on in the when they started. Guys like when you're starting out from scratch, guys with name value from other places that like big time name value, like Jericho, like Moxley. I think they were hugely important to the company, and they were needed. And this likewise, I also don't think you should be militant about, if a big star from WWE that can really contribute and isn't going to take this as like a working vacation becomes available, you'd be crazy not to sign them and push them. But I do think 5 years in, you do want to kind of be in the position they finally found themselves in, where you feel like you have your own history and most of your major names feel like either created by AEW or they've really been adopted by AEW, not just big stars from the past on a stop here. And I don't think they were quite there, but I think there was a danger of there were at times where they maybe flirted a little bit with the danger of being like past TNA sometimes, where you have these really talented guys that kind of feel like they belong to you, like some of the X Division guys and Joe and stuff, but they're always and they do get pushed intermittently, but then you would find in a lot of eras of TNA, they would always end up taking a backseat because whoever was the new flavor of the day, whoever's the new big available star from WWE, they just come in. Well, they have to get pushed immediately. And if you do that too much, you create this kind of tier system where it feels where you kind of train your fans to feel like our homegrown guys, they're fairly big, but they're not as big as WWE guys. And whenever WWE big guys come in, they go back to the back of the line because those guys will take precedence. And right now I feel like, again, they have a good mix, and it doesn't feel like that. It feels like if you watch AEW, that the top stars are people. And I guess the last thing I'd end on is it's especially important given how the troubles AEW has had with some prominent wrestlers very clearly not treating AEW as like a place they really want to be, as treating it instead as a place where they don't see this as the big time. They don't want to do jobs here. They feel like they're biding their time until they can go back to WWE. And I think again, that's another thing when you look at like the history of places like TNA, you really want to be careful about pruning that stuff as much as possible, because that nothing's going to make you feel more minor league than having too many stories like that come out.
Yeah, that's a harsh lesson that I think that the company had to learn. Uh, and it kind of makes sense. Like, I think sometimes we think of Tony and AEW, and we think like, oh, like he's running the company and he needs to do this, he needs to do that, and oh, why do you do this and why do you do that? And he's like, this is a guy had never run a wrestling company before. And I think there are a lot of things that you learn during your years running a wrestling company for the first time. And I think one of them was being more selective with who is available. Um, there was a time where basically anyone that kind of fit like a stylistic vision of AEW, Tony wanted to sign. So that's how we got Miro. That's how we got Andrade. That's how we got Malachi Black. And in the long run, those guys were not productive members of the roster because they were not actually good fits for AEW. And in the long run, they should have never been signed, even though they might have had some good moments here or there. And I think Tony's become a lot more understanding of that. We haven't seen him be nearly as aggressive. I think just signing anyone that's available to him. And the result, again, I think, and also letting some people go, right? Letting some of these guys either walk back to WWE or not renewing their contracts, and I think that's gotten us back to a much healthier point. And I think hopefully for the long run, Tony's learned to be a little bit more prudent in who he decides to bring in, because that's a key factor, as you mentioned, with these guys coming in not wanting to do jobs.
Yeah, I mean, there's debate right now. Everyone's thinking, is the Hurt Business one of those acts? And I think we're going to get to the point where maybe we're going to find out, sooner or later, because I feel like the clock is ticking, waiting on. It's not that those guys shouldn't be pushed, but, there are rumors about have they refused to do jobs? Have they not? People instantly got their rankles up about, it feels weird that Lashley came in, immediately beats Swerve and doesn't return the loss. Lashley hasn't really lost, and that I think the interesting thing now is fans, AEW fans are kind of hyper aware of that stuff now, and they're looking for it. Whereas before, it kind of had to happen for a while, where now I'm not 100% sure that's even the case. We're just in the realm of rumors. The booking of them is still relatively soon. Maybe they're just building to a big loss. Like I feel like, we're seeing that with Mercedes, where everyone, there's this segment of people, a lot of them aren't AEW fans, so that are trying to say, oh, Mercedes won't job and stuff. And I haven't seen anything that suggests that's rooted in reality. I think what we're seeing is, maybe I'll be proven wrong again, I think what we're seeing is just a strong push leading for a major big ticket star that they likely gave a huge contract to, building to hopefully meaningful wins. I mean, losses to other people down the line. But, AEW fans have now been primed to be on guard for that stuff, because they've seen so many examples of people that have treated AEW as kind of beneath them. And going to what you said, like, I do think it's fascinating that Tony Khan is a very savvy, smart guy in a lot of ways. He's clearly a student of wrestling, grew up as a big time fan, and like not just any fan, but like a very nerdy internet fan. And I mean that in a good way. And yet I feel like there were still some lessons he had to learn through experience, because if you look at the way in the early months of AEW, the way he talked about like WWE was much softer than he there was almost a little naivete about, like, clearly, I mean, he knew his history, that what WWE does to competition, but it felt like he kind of had to experience it before he took a little harder edge and started throwing some shots back and being a little more expecting counter programming and these kind of things and the pettiness that can happen to come about. And I feel like it was the same with these kind of wrestlers, where it took him some Miros and Malachi Blacks, even though he should have been aware of that from wrestling history, to learn, I think, a very important lesson, which is, wrestlers can be great in other companies. You can say, oh, this wrestler from WWE is leaving or is getting released, and man, they're great there. That'd be a great sign for us. But just because that's who they are in WWE doesn't mean that's going to be what they are in your promotion. You need to gauge them on mindset first. And I keep bringing up TNA just because they're the best example we have since WCW of a company that was in a similar position in some ways. And there were so many people that, big names that were great talents from WWE that went to TNA and got pushes, and they did 50% of the effort. So they weren't valuable the way you would hope they would be. And then there were people like Drew McIntyre, who, as Drew Galloway, clearly went into TNA and the indies scene too at the same time with a chip on his shoulder, and maybe even at that first moment he had in his mind, I'd love to go back to WWE one day, but he was going to work his ass off and prove WWE wrong. And those are the people you want. You want the Swerve Stricklands of the world. You want the people who are like, I have a passion for wrestling. I am hungry for this, and I'm going to prove people wrong. Like, fuck them for releasing me, and not the people who do the Ariel Helwani. Although I know I'm referencing Corey Jade, and I think it's a little unfair because it wasn't, you need a little bit more full context for her quote there. But the vibe of, gosh, I hope whatever I did wrong to get released, I hope one day I can earn their love again. I want more, if I'm signing someone from WWE, I want a little more fuck you in them,
Yeah, it's one of those things that, like you said, I think I said Tony had to learn it, but fans had to learn it too, right? Like you mentioned, like now fans are being much more aware of what's been going on with I'm sorry if my audio's a little off. I'm going through some minor technical difficulties, but fans had to learn that as well. And you said they're picking up on it now, where it might actually be working against the Hurt Syndicate, who, like you said, might just be experiencing a normal push. But now people are wondering that, maybe they're going to not be one of those malcontents backstage that don't want to do jobs, and that would be bad for the company. And it's kind of created an extra anxiety level that definitely wasn't there when the company first started.
Yeah, like again, I don't know with them. I feel like we're starting to get to the time, like, with them being in a three-way for All In. Is that just a way to get the tag titles off them without having to lose to anybody directly? Like, I think we're getting to the point where we're going to start to really figure out, is this losses? Are these rumors true? Or are they just waiting for the right moment? We'll find out soon. But the fact is, we're now, yeah, like we're primed to be on guard and be aware of that before we even really are completely 100% sure sometimes now, which, it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's funny. I was thinking the other day, I wonder, and I don't know if this would be good, but like there is kind of an idea on paper of a ready-made character for the right wrestler, which is the WWE cast-off that thinks they're better than AEW. Like, I don't know, like, I think it's kind of dangerous to play with that idea because you don't want to make yourself seem
And
small potatoes.
the
But I
meta
do,
character that comes in and says
yeah,
they
I
only
mean,
do jobs.
yeah, I mean, you don't want to do that, the Vince Russo where you're breaking the fourth wall and all that. But the idea of someone that kind of gives the air that they think they're better than this, that they're not really playing ball. Yeah, but then a wrestler who's embodying that character that actually will play ball in the end, because that's building on real resentments and real fears fans have, and it sucks because some of these wrestlers for AEW have gotten real heat that they can't capitalize on because once people realize what's going on with them, they're being iced out and waiting to go back to WWE when the contract runs out. Well, imagine if you could get that same kind of resentment but then build it to a loss that puts over somebody. I mean, again, I don't know necessarily even think that'd be that might be a terrible idea, but I just think it is at least an interesting idea to think about, that the idea of playing with that, but who knows?
Yeah, it's interesting, and I want to go back to AEW Revolution this year, which was a very widely positively received show, with the exception of the main event, which people did not like. And if people remember, that's the main event with John Moxley and Adam Copeland that turned into the triple threat match when Christian Cage cashed in his knockoff Money in the Bank contract. And I wrote an article following that show for voiceofwrestling.com, and it was really just focusing on everything we saw on the undercard, right? That's a show opened up with Hangman Page versus MJF in that really good match. And then we saw Swerve versus Ricochet. And we saw the Tony Storm Mariah May big blow off match, the Hollywood ending. And then we had, Osprey and Fletcher working the semi-main event in that steel cage match. And it was like very clearly AEW had all of these talents that were young and in their prime and delivering at this super high level. And then we got this main event with John Moxley and then these two guys that are like 50. And it was just such a vibe change from what was a young and exciting wrestling promotion. And then, oh, it's time for the retirement home main event. And that was kind of like this worrying sign because the company had so much potential. It was all right there, but still the thing that's holding them back is this weird main event. And at the time, it was this very long Copeland versus Moxley program. With Moxley not really being the problem there, because I would say he's still a wrestler that's in his prime. But certainly Cope and Christian are on the back end of their careers. And then I think since then there's been a really positive pivot. Now you could just say, well, that's because Copeland went away, and so Moxley's moved on to wrestling other opponents, and there's been other guys that aren't necessarily young like Samoa Joe that have been involved with Moxley. But I think at the end of the day, the company's done a much better job, like you said, building around those core four young guys and guys that are all in what we would consider to be the beginning of their primes of their wrestling careers.
Yeah, and yeah, it's funny how the reaction of that Revolution pay-per-view, where that was a great example of sometimes the main event can, you can have a good show, and if the main event's bad, it can leave a sour taste in a lot of people's mouths. And likewise, I've seen shows that haven't been very good, but you have an amazing main event, and people are like, "Yeah, that was worth my money." And yeah, it is just, again, there's nothing wrong with using veterans, but sometimes I feel like Tony almost gives them a little too much creative influence, a little too much respect to their past. Like, it's tough. There's a balancing act. 'Cause I think one thing that's very good about AEW and Tony is he treats veterans with respect, and he doesn't, shy away from their past. He like celebrates it, and just that it seems like he gives a lot of his wrestlers a little more input. Some people see that as a bad thing. I don't think that's a bad thing, and that's been normal for wrestling history. But it's like anything else. It's how much input you give and which people do you give input to. And it's like the old thing where the same fire that can cook your dinner can burn your hand, where you give creative control to a 34-year-old guy that has really good instincts, and by creative control, I don't mean anything more special than just listening to their ideas and allowing them a lot more input into what they do. You're going to be sitting pretty, and give that to same creative control to like a guy in his late 40s, maybe, that wants to relive their past and doesn't have a lot of new ideas. I'm not thinking of anyone specific. I'm just using that as like a base kind of template. And that same good like intention is going to really sour your product and create some real dead segments and things like that. And again, I think that's one of the really exciting, well, I'm kind of dreading it partly, but that's going to be one of the really interesting things we see in the coming months when some of these veterans like Jericho and Cope come back, which is how much of this is them being a little more selective about who to push in the top way, and how much of that is just certain people that they would give that leeway to aren't around and sucking up some of the oxygen and segment time and all that.
It's a good point. One of the best criticisms of AEW I've heard in quite some time was that AEW at times is a home for all of these ex-WWE wrestlers, especially these veteran wrestlers like Copeland, to do the things that they wanted to do that Vince McMahon wouldn't let them do. And that hasn't always been something that's like super helpful for the company, right? Cope and Christian want to do their big feud that they never really got to do the way they wanted to do in WWE. So they're going to do it in AEW when they're both in their 50s. And the Hurt Syndicate comes in and they want to basically do what they wanted to do in WWE and then had their legs cut off from them. And that's not new. That's not innovative. That's not something that's going to help AEW create its own identity or further establish the identity that it's worked to create. And that's something that I'm wary about. I'm not really that worried about Jericho in the sense that I think Jericho has basically been like a mid-card guy for a
Yeah.
while now. And yeah, if he comes back, will he be different? He's shown the ability to pivot. He's like I would expect when Jericho comes back that he's going to be some sort of different character, and it will, at least for a short period of time, get over and people will be excited about it because that's really his legacy in his career. I have a little bit less confidence in Copeland, but we'll see what ends up happening.
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
Jericho has a chance to do something that he used to be great at, that he got into a weird section of his career here where he forgot to do it, which is Jericho for years used to be very savvy about not overstaying his welcome, using his, outside interests like Fozzy and, there's a little bit of Hollywood stuff to find reasons to leave for a while so he doesn't overstay his welcome. And then when he came back, to be refreshened and have a new gimmick. And even though he kept trying new gimmicks with like the bad apple stuff and all of that, like the learning tree stuff, it was like, this felt like the first time in a long time where he had overstayed his welcome to the point where you could hear fans were starting to resent him. And he had just not taken a break, like a significant break, in a long time. So it'll be interesting to see, can he go, as he's getting on in years, can he find one more, can he do that trick he used to do so often one more time, where he comes back, maybe the resentment lowers a bit, and then maybe people, when they're saying, okay, I'll take another look at you, he has something new to say. But he's getting older, and I don't know if his instincts are quite as sharp as they were in the past. I'm not. Well, again, we'll see. Again, that's another interesting thing to see if and when he comes back. Is, you know, there's a bunch of things coming up where, whether it's like the Hurt Syndicate, we're going to find out. Are they willing to do business or not? Guys like Cope and Jericho, and like, are AEW willing to like kind of put them in the proper proportions and place? All of that stuff we're going to find out in the coming months. And I think a big thing with being a booker, it's generating ideas, but a big part of being being a wrestling booker is being a filter for everyone around you, because when you're a wrestling booker, everyone around you is coming to you with ideas, whether you have a creative staff, your agents, your roster, obviously, just goddamn reporters, and people on Twitter. Everyone is giving you their opinion, and your job as a filter is not to say no to everyone, and it's not to say yes to everyone. It's to hear 10 ideas, be able to identify the 3 that are good and use them, and be able to point out this, not just be able to identify the 7 that are bad, but be able to say no to them in a way that if they're big stars, they don't resent you for being like, well, you said yes to those 3 guys ideas. It's a lot of massaging egos. It's a lot of juggling plates, and I really hope that what we're seeing this year has been the filter getting sharper, and not just less things being put in the filter, less objectionable things being put in the filter to begin with, so we don't have to worry about how good the filter is. I think Tony has said recently, maybe on this week on the media tour promoting All In, something to the effect of he thinks AEW has been really good in this year, in part because there's fewer voices. To me, that's an encouraging sign if he's identifying that as like.
This is a really key point in, I think, what we're talking about, what's gone right, is that, and he's been very vocal about this, and he said this a few times over the last few months, which is basically him saying, I've had to learn to be able to say no to more ideas, and I've had fewer voices, and it's been my creative vision, and he's really taken a lot more personal responsibility for everything that's been put in front of him, and not just focusing on, oh, what does this wrestler want to do? Oh, okay, they want to do this, let's let them do that. And I think that's totally reflected in the product.
Yeah, and I think you had a good point too, which was, kind of talking about, wrestlers, like what their dreams are, and letting wrestlers do the things they never got to do in other places. Like, if it's a good idea, it's great to do that, because I don't think you're ever going to get a better performance from a wrestler than when they're the most personally invested in what they're doing. And how can they be any more personally invested than if an idea is something they've come up with that they want to do? But like, going to what you were saying, like, just because a wrestler has an idea doesn't mean it's good. And a lot of wrestlers come up with a ton of bugfuck terrible ideas. Like, there are ones you hear rumors of, there's ones you sometimes see on the screen, and it doesn't matter how invested they are if it's a terrible idea. And yeah, I think we're talking about like lessons he's had to learn through experience. I think, and I hope we're seeing some of the signs that he's learned. That's one of those lessons he's been learning through experience, which is, a wrestler having input and personal investment in what they're doing is great, but just because a wrestler has an idea doesn't mean it's good.
Yeah, and obviously wrestlers that are getting paid more money, that have a bigger reputation, are going to have a little bit more control than other wrestlers. And I think we're also part of the issue of, you're going to bring in all these ex-WWE talents that are going to be making a lot of money, that are veteran wrestlers. That part of I think the appeal of going to AEW as one of these older established veterans is the idea that you can have a lot more control and a bigger imprint, not only on what you're doing, but what the whole company is doing, in a way that you could never possibly even dream about doing in WWE. That's something that's I think attractive to some of these guys. I think it's certainly attractive to people like Jericho. Um, and to give Jericho a lot of credit here, I think Jericho's run in AEW so far, which is now 6 years, I think has gone basically exactly the way he wanted it to, which is, when the company started, they really needed him. They needed him to anchor shows. They needed him to be the original champion. They needed him for media attention. He was by far the biggest, most recognizable mainstream name that they had on their roster, and they used him a lot. And like you said, he didn't take that, time off like he always does. He was on screen a lot. But over time, the company became less reliant on him. Other people stepped up. They were able to establish other stars, in no small part due to Jericho's role himself, right? Jericho put over MJF very early during his time in the company. Jericho put over Orange Cassidy. Jericho put over Will Ospreay. Jericho did all of this stuff using his talent and his recognition to help make these other guys bigger deals. And now the company is in a space where they don't need him anymore. Chris Jericho could leave AEW tomorrow, and the company would have almost it would have no impact on the company, which is a good thing. It's where you want to be 6 years after the company first started, and Chris Jericho was the guy you really needed in 2019. It's great to be in a spot in 2025 where you don't need him nearly as much, despite the fact that I think his contributions to the company should be respected by Tony and everyone else.
Yeah, like if you need Chris Jericho nearly as much in 2025 as you did when AEW started, you've done something really wrong. And that's nothing against Chris Jericho, even. That's just the goal of guys that old at that stage of their career should be to help the next generation. And Jericho's really obviously really divisive, because there are people that will tell you, like, he doesn't put people over, like he will lose to them, but they'll point to the fact that he does little things that doesn't do it well, and that he's the heat vulture, where he finds whoever's hot, and then those people always leave their feuds less hot than he comes into, or like he'll lose on a pay-per-view but then win back on a TV. And then there are people like Jericho's the most selfless guy ever. I'm in the middle, where I think Jericho does really want to work with hot people, which, who wouldn't?
Yeah,
And
that's something every wrestler wants to do.
yeah,
No
but
wrestler is like,
has,
oh yeah, I want to go work with that wrestler who's ice cold.
yeah, but I guess with Jericho, he, unlike a lot of wrestlers, he has the power to kind of make that happen more often than not. And I do think he wants to genuinely put over people, but where I would not go full positive on him is, I think a lot of his feuds aren't that good. So like it's like, I don't think he intends to suck the heat out of them, but I feel like a lot of feuds, even when he puts them over in the end, they're not the kind of triumphant, huge, popular, great endings where you go, man, like that really made me excited to see. Like I was like, well, that was okay. And that wrestler feels like they're kind of in a similar place. Yeah, they beat Jericho, but they're kind of in a similar place from where they started. But that's also not completely Jericho's fault. And I guess that's a point I want to make. That's one problem, because I think AEW is on one of their best creative streaks they've been on in their entire history. Just a really good, like, no drama, no muss, no fuss, nuts and bolts wrestling for a few months. That's just good. But I can tell you all sorts of flaws I still find in AEW, things I wish they did differently, little and big things. But another thing that I'm waiting to see if they've really cut back on it or not, and we'll see, is, I think, something that's affected people that have feuded with Jericho, which is, AEW has no problem with identifying people that get organically hot and then quickly identifying them and elevating them and giving them a big win and a big initial push. They know a lot of companies throughout history have had problems with that because they have weird biases of who deserves a push and who doesn't. AEW largely doesn't have that. But what AEW has had a problem with is what they do after they give that person the initial big win or initial 1 month push. And there's a lot of times where you watch AEW and a guy gets a big initial win, and then you watch the next 4 weeks and you're like, oh, you had no other ideas. Like you didn't think this any further than, well, we should give this guy a push. And we can even point to recent examples of, and not that I think they're great, like I think a lot of guys I'd rather see on TV than them, but I don't think they're without talent. But like Private Party, they gave those guys the tag titles, maybe just because the Bucks wanted to help them out. And AEW clearly had no follow-up for that. Or Anthony Bowens. He gets this big relaunch with, as a single star after a little bit of an absence, where he gets to beat Max Caster, which, everyone was waiting for that to happen. He has like new gear and a new kind of nickname and, new Jane's Addiction music that he always wanted. And they clearly didn't have any other ideas, like a follow-up. And I think a lesson that I think AEW needs to hopefully to learn is, when you're pushing somebody initially, giving them that new push to a new level, what they do in the month to 3 months afterwards is just as important, if not more important, than that initial big win over a star or that initial title win. And if you have no ideas afterwards, if you're just going to start giving them random matches on Collision, with no real story, and then, we'll find something for them on the pay-per-view in the last 3 weeks beforehand, like, to me, what people should be asking when they push someone, when they're about to push someone in AEW, is not just who do they beat, what title do they get, when do they win it. You need that answer, but you also need the answer of what's their next 3 months, what's their feud after we do this, what do they instantly go into. And if you don't have a good answer to that, then you shouldn't even start the push to begin with. And they've done that quite a few times in their history.
Yeah, I think when you're describing the gets the big win but then has no follow-up, I believe they call out that the word low.
Yeah.
And part of it is also like a talent issue. And I think that's the same thing with Jericho. And to connect it back to Jericho too, is like when Jericho put over MJF, right? MJF went on to do things, but that's because MJF's really talented and he's someone that can thrive in various feuds, not just when he's feuding with Chris Jericho, one of the biggest stars in the company. I think the same thing can be said about someone like Will Ospreay. When he's working with somebody maybe at a lower level and trying to put them over, it doesn't always work that well. Uh, I think in terms of follow-up, and Anthony Bowens is a good example too, which is again when we're talking about this leaner kind of roster where you have people kind of really locked into certain roles, there are going to be some casualties to that. If you have a really good roster, you sign a lot of people, you got a lot of talented people in the locker room, like which AEW has, there's not going to be enough room for everybody on towards the top of the food chain, right? And so you have Anthony Bowens who, the tag team with Max Caster kind of ran its course. You wanted to kind of, okay, here comes a big push for Anthony Bowens. And I wouldn't have paired him with Billy Gunn still. I think that was a major mistake.
I mean, there are more problems with Anthony Bowens' current singles run than just AEW's booking of it. I mean, there are some things that aren't clicking. But
I guess my point is that, okay, if we want to really push Anthony Bowens, we got to find a spot for him on our current roster where he can win matches and be in relevant feuds. And you look at the AEW roster and it's like, all right, if we're going to give Anthony Bowens more TV time, we're going to give him on-screen wins and all this stuff. Who are we not giving that to? Who should Anthony Bowens leapfrog? Name a name on the AEW roster right now who's doing something significant and say that Anthony Bowens should be in that spot. It's a tough sell for me. And I really like Anthony Bowens, but there's a limited amount of opportunities in a company. And it's like, well, they're not going to stop pushing Hangman Page or Will Ospreay or MJF or Kyle Fletcher in favor of Anthony Bowens. It's just not going to happen. He's just one of several people on the AEW roster who's like, yeah, they probably could be doing more if they were able to pick up more wins on TV and if they were, got a run with the TNT Championship. It's a tough time to be someone coming into the AEW roster because those spots are locked up. And unlike in past eras where they were locked up by somebody who might be older or injury prone, they're locked up by people that are really in their prime. And it's going to be difficult to find opportunities going forward.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point too. Like the biggest resource a wrestling promotion has, and one of their most finite ones, is time. You only have so much TV time. You only have so much kind of room in the fans' eyes to so many people that you can kind of occupy in their heads at one time. And I feel like a lot of times I've even seen people I respect who talk about wrestling sometimes being like, oh, there's no harm in signing as many good people as you have. Like if there's a good person available, sign them. You can always find room. And it's like, you really can't. There are only, if you want, and I think sometimes AEW has made the mistake of, they've tried to feature as many people on their pay-per-views and TV as possible, when that's not how wrestling succeeds. That's not how wrestlers succeed. Wrestling has typically been a business where you identify your key guys and you make sure you give them plenty of time and a consistent presence on your TV pretty much every week. And then everyone else can kind of fit in along the margins. And again, that's another thing I think AEW has done better with that core for this year. We'll see if they stick to that. But yeah, going to what you said, every time you push someone, that should be a question, which is like, all right, this guy hasn't been getting a push, or this guy hasn't been getting featured, or this guy, we're signing them, they haven't been working here when we want to bring them in. The follow-up question you always need to ask is, who are we downshifting? Who's leaving then at their expense? Because it has to be a trade. And if you don't have a good answer for that, then you shouldn't do it.
Right. If you look out throughout wrestling history and look at when a new star really took off or someone's career was really made, it's usually pretty closely in correlation with another more established wrestler leaving, right? We can point to like the classic example is like Steve Austin and The Rock, right? How did they become super successful? And it's like, well, Bret Hart left, Shawn Michaels retired, Nash and Hall left to WCW. Like there was a real opportunity. WWF needed to make a new star. Here comes Steve Austin. Let's push him. Here comes this young guy, The Rock. Let's push him. Right? That's how their careers got established. But it's been true pretty much throughout all of wrestling history. Um, and in AEW, especially when you're talking about the top main events, there's been main event slots. There's been some opportunities there, right? Cody Rhodes left the company. CM Punk had his whole incident, left the company. Brian Danielson retired. Chris Jericho's kind of gone away, or at least been certainly phased down in a way that's provided another main event opportunity. So you've had space for people like Swerve, people like Hangman Page to kind of step in. But like you said, the most valuable thing a wrestling promotion has is time and also like resources and time to win and stuff like that. Like it's funny if you compare Max Caster and Anthony Bowens in terms of like how their breakup, who's doing better and faring better from their post breakup. I think clearly the company is focused on pushing Anthony Bowens as like a serious wrestling competitor. But Max Caster, because his character is kind of almost designed to lose, is actually faring much better than Bowens in terms of connecting with the audience and getting over. Um, Largely because his character's been designed as a preliminary act that can lose to pretty much anybody on the roster, which is kind of a fascinating development. But it goes to show like how hard it is to kind of break into the next, echelon of talent, even if you are really talented.
Yeah, and I think there's one other bad negative side effect to signing too many people is even when you don't force them in, when you're starting to do more of what Tony's been doing this last cycle of just accepting that certain people aren't going to have to sit on the bench for a long time. The problem with that is when you have people that are just sitting at home for months on end that are healthy, is you get stories like the Britt Baker story we've had the last 2 weeks where Tony and Britt both had to come out and say like, we don't hate each other. She could come back. And Tony just said, like, I think Tony says on Do the Effective, we just have a deep roster and she's on the bench right now. And, whether that's all there is to it or not, I have no idea. But it is not good when you have so many people on your roster that there are people that eventually get resentful and make tweets because that's just bad vibes and bad stories. You don't want taking up oxygen that could be used to talk about the positive things in your company. And if those wrestlers ideally are talented enough to have fans, you don't want fans to resent. You don't want fans to see you as the company that might take their personal favorite and just prevent you from seeing them work for anybody because, even though in a way, Tony's heart in some ways is in the right place of the sense of, I know he believes that like, and he's had a couple exceptions, which I don't think is great, but like generally he believes, if I sign a person, I'm paying them till the end of the contract. Even if I decide I've made a mistake, I'm going to pay them all the way through their contract, but I'm also going to hold them to that contract because I don't want to set a precedent that if they're unhappy, anyone can just, leave whenever they want because my competition won't do that. But, ideally you don't want to have way more people than you can use because you just don't want people sitting on the bench. There's too many negatives to that. And like, I think today, like in an hour or two before we started recording, I think I saw a thing where like Billy Gunn made a tweet to like his kids, like, are you guys still working here? And stuff like that, where it's like, is it the biggest deal in the grand scheme of things? No, but like, you don't want anyone talking about anything right this week that isn't all in, how excited everyone should be going in and all the stuff that's happening. You don't want anything like that, like distracting people. And you just open yourself up to that when you have such a giant roster that you have like double digit people where like a regular conversation AEW fans have had to have the entire time because this company also is so secretive about so many things is this wrestler hurt? Do they have a private issue that is not appropriate to talk about? Or Are they on the outs? Are they refusing to lose? Are they going to come back eventually? But the AEW is just waiting for the right time. And there have been wrestlers that have been like each of those things I've just said has been true for different wrestlers, but you never know. And it creates just this huge
Trevor, isn't
energy
part of
sink.
that this media dynamic we have where backstage intrigue is in gossip and in backstage news is treated almost as more interesting than the storylines or the action that's happening on screen, while also complemented by the fact that we live in a news industry that seems to be starved for as much anti AEW and AEW dysfunction news as possible. Because I feel like that is a major role in why this gets so much attention. And I honestly don't know how much of that is even resonating with the more casual fan. It's certainly aware to people like you and I who have no lives, but for like your regular wrestling fan, are they really having this many conversations about Britt Baker and her status? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how. I mean, look, I think the company is in a pretty good place right now. But again, you know, I just don't think you want to be a situation where if someone likes Britt Baker, they grow to resent you because it's like, I haven't seen her in so long now, and I haven't been told why, and I'm getting vague illusions that there's no good reason why. And I just don't think you want. I don't think that's good for the wrestler. I don't think that's good for the company. I don't think that's good for the fans. And it's not something you have to do. You just have to be realistic about how many people you can have on your roster and how many people you can serve. It goes back to what we were just talking about, which is, you know, you have to be very aware of every push you give is eating into, a certain amount of resources you have to offer. And there's a roster size that's you literally is unsustainable for that.
One thing I wanted to focus on, especially over the last few months, is how good AEW has been in general about creating baby faces and having babyface stars. And I think that's something that pre-AEW and even into the first few years of AEW's run, American wrestling is just really poor at baby faces and babyface development. It's something that WWE has been awful at for a long time now, in terms of having baby faces that the fans really care about, that are really over in the buildings, and that in turn are easier to get heat on for the heels because people actually want to see the baby faces win these matches. And I think, especially over the last few months, we're talking about this hot streak that AEW has been on. You have people like Hangman Page, who's now fully full blown back being a babyface and is the kind of, you know, babyface that fans have this emotional investment in. It takes a lot of work, and very few talent are going to be able to kind of deliver on that end. But people really believe in Hangman Page. People really believe in Will Ospreay. They love Will Ospreay. People really love Tony Storm. And I just think they've done a really, really strong job, specifically with baby faces. And that is something that I just think in general, the American wrestling audience has been completely underserved over the last like 15 years. Like, who are truly the best baby face, biggest baby face stars the last 15 years in American pro wrestling? And it's a pretty small list when you compare that to like any other time in wrestling history.
Yeah, and I think one thing is, we so much of wrestling's history has been dominated the last 20 years, first with Cena and then with Roman, of a promotion deciding that someone's not just going to be a top guy, but they're going to be a top baby face. And if the crowd's telling them, maybe we even like this person, but we just don't want to see them as the top guy just yet, or we don't want to see them as a baby face right now, how stubbornly they stuck to it. And it's one of those easy.
Trevor, sorry. I was just gonna say that happened for so long that people thought the default setting for any babyface was that half the fans boo them.
Yeah, yeah,
People
exactly.
seriously thought that because that was what WWE taught us for decades.
And it's one of those easy wins, that there's less of them now than when AEW started against WWE, when they were in a real creative and even popularity kind of lull. But like, it's still one of those easy wins by comparison of just, you look better by just doing the simplest wrestling thing ever, which is listen to what the fans want. Who are they cheering most for? Push them as baby faces. When they stop it, turn them like it's the easiest thing. And I think though one good thing they've done in addition to that is we talk about those core four and all those guys, the baby faces in that I think have been really good about being people that just aren't just good baby faces, but they've been really good in the media of being like very full-throated, making compelling arguments of like, I love AEW. AEW is important. They've been great for me. They've been great for wrestling. And not every big push wrestler in AEW has been great at that or compelling it or convincing at that. And, I think Ospreay does a good job. Swerve does an amazing job at that. Hangman, does a good job of that. And one thing I wanted to bring up, and I think this is maybe a good place to do it, is like Hangman could not come off as a better babyface than what he did in Grand Slam Mexico at that opening promo. And I think that was another great way. And I don't think AEW in so many ways, I don't think they distinguish themselves from WWE nearly as much as they should. I think they do so many things that are still tropes that WWE uses. That old story, I think Joe Lanza told it. Forgive me, it was someone else, where it was a wrestler, I think maybe CM Punk, where he didn't like, there was some weird thing in a segment he didn't want them to do, I forget what, and someone working at AEW told him as a way of saying like it was going to happen, like that's just how wrestling is now. And I think AEW is, if we're talking about flaws they still have, I think there's still so many things AEW does these days where if you ask them they're very WWE-ish, and they're not necessarily to their positivity, like, and so many things that the answer is just, well, that's the way it's been done for 20 years now. Like the egregious cutaway to the wrestler watching the match on a monitor in the back at a weird angle. Like, there are other ways to remind fans this person's in a feud with this wrestler right now. It's not compelling. It comes off as corny, and it also comes off as you're imitating WWE. Why do they do it? Well, that's just the way wrestling's been for 20 years. And so anyway, saying all of that, I will say a great way they differentiated themselves was, I think when WWE did Worlds Collide and when AEW did a Grand Slam Mexico, the fact that the opening segment of Worlds Collide was Rey Mysterio basically telling the fans that like now WWE has like given legitimacy to Lucha Libre, and Hangman told the fans, this personal story that seemed real. I would be surprised if it wasn't, but if it wasn't real, it felt real, about like working with Mexican day laborers and the values they taught him. And it ended with him basically being like, thank you for letting us come to your house. I think that shows you a great difference between the two companies philosophy wise, which is WWE has always been this philosophy of, when we work with someone else, we make them more like us, and like we give the seal of approval. Like, it's always this era, if you come to us, you're working, you're in the big leagues now, kid. And there are some advantages to that, but there are some disadvantages. But the AEW philosophy, I think when they work with other people, has been more like, they're different, they're separate, they're very cool, and what an honor it is that we get to like play with their toys for a while, or we get to exist in their world for a while. It did not, AEW did not come down to Arena Mexico and go, finally, AEW has graced Arena Mexico with its presence. The energy was very much, hey, it's so cool that we get to be here. And I think Hangman, like you talk about like babyface vibes, how can that not be like a feel-good babyface you want to support? That someone that's just so gracious, I mean,
Yeah.
you don't feel graciousness from a lot of baby faces.
I really want to hammer this point home because I think it's so important, in just how bad the babyface scene was kind of pre-AEW's launch, in the degree that people just kind of came to the realization that babyfaces always had to be boring, generic characters, and the reason the heels were more popular was because the heels were dynamic. The heels took action. The heels did things. The heels outsmarted the baby faces. The heels had friends. The heels were part of cool groups that wore matching outfits and had catchphrases and things like that. And the baby faces were all chumps. And that was just such a crutch for how American wrestling was booked for so long. And I think AEW has really helped break the mold. And now you're seeing not just baby faces, but new baby faces, guys that haven't been around for decades and been on TV forever. And I think it is creating a lot more energy both in the buildings and when you're watching on television, when you're seeing these new kind of heroes. And that's what show business and entertainment is about. It's about building heroes and getting people, emotionally invested in things, whether it's a movie, a TV show, or pro wrestling. And I think AEW's just done such a great job. And I think Hangman Page is the perfect example of that. But you also have people like Swerve and people like Will Ospreay and people that, they're different, they are very different than Hangman, but provide similar kind of value. And those are the guys that you're building around. And it's a huge contrast to WWE. It's a huge contrast to what people have come to expect from pro wrestling. And I think it's something that's really different, that can be done at a high level. We mentioned like these guys doing media and stuff like that. And we also talked about like what has Tony Khan learned and kind of the changing atmosphere of the locker room and not bringing in guys who are malcontents. MJF gave an interview with TV Insider a couple days ago and kind of making the rounds, and it was really interesting. He got asked a question about like how would you describe working with Tony Khan and what do you think he's taken from his past experiences when it comes to running AEW? And he gave this really interesting answer, which is I'm going to read the whole thing here, but he says. The other thing I would say Tony Khan has learned is you want people in your locker room that not only want to be there, but are worthy of being there. We've had a lot of guys in the past come in and think they are going to be king shit just because they had their time in the sun for a millisecond in other promotions. That's not how it fucking works. It's called all elite wrestling, not all average wrestling, not all mediocre wrestling, not all I'm going to show up, cash a check, and expect to be world champion wrestling. It's all elite wrestling. Right now, everyone in the locker room is on the same page. We aren't coming here to cash a check. We aren't coming to give 50%. We're all giving 110%. If you think you're going to come into my company, and yes, I said my company because I've been here since day one and I'm the best professional wrestler in the world. If you think you're going to come into my company and barely put in work, you're out of your goddamn mind. You don't belong here. We don't want you here. So stay where you are and be miserable over there because you don't belong swimming in the ocean of sharks that is AEW. And you're talking to the biggest shark of them all, an MJF. So he's clearly in character to a degree there, but I think there's a lot of truth and certainly a lot of experience, not just from Tony, but from MJF as a younger guy navigating the locker room, which is like, yes, if you want to come into this locker room, you better have the right attitude because you're not gonna, I don't think that shit's gonna be tolerated anymore in a way that maybe it was when these guys were a little bit more naive, 5 years ago.
Although it is interesting that MJF is now aligned in storyline with, again, the group that might be one of the people that is still, again, we'll see one of those acts that might be the act that thinks they're a little too good to do complete business and things like that. We'll see. But, yeah. And, I agree with a lot of what he said. There was a little bit where he's like, touching on, wrestlers not being good enough. I think AEW, they've mostly been on the money with who they've signed, like from WWE in terms of talent. But again, like Miro, I think once he got off the weird video game introduction, his in-ring performances were, I thought, fantastic in AEW. I thought he was great. Malachi Black at his best could be a decently valuable as long as you don't let him control too much of his storylines and promo spooky shit, but like, which I think is completely up his own ass. But like, a lot of these guys that turned out to be flubs, if they had just been willing to lose and been willing to put in 100%, they would have been good signs, which again goes back to what I'm saying, which is a sign can be great on paper, but if they're coming in at 50%, it's not worth it. So it doesn't matter if they look good on paper. You have to try and do your best to make sure they're going to be that same person that you want to sign in your company. And yeah, there should be this mindset that when you come to AEW, it's like, you better have your working shoes on because we're going to expose you if you don't keep up with the rest of us. Like you better take this as a challenge.
Yeah, and that's a strong message when we talk about the core four. Like, if you're coming into AEW and you want to be a big star, you want to main event a show, okay, well, you're going to follow a Will Ospreay match. So good luck. You better be on that level. And some guys have risen to that level, and other guys have not. And I think that's also when you're talking about who we're going to push, who we're going to present, what's the message of AEW, when that message is more younger stars and when you're pushing guys more in their prime, it does send, I think, a strong message where if you might be a big star, you might have some TV exposure being on WWE, and you might your name in an SEO search would pop up ahead of some other people's. But if you are going to stand out in this company if you don't have your working shoes on and you're not going to work hard. And I think that's that's kind of, I think if we're going to go back to like the Hurt Syndicate, which I'm not like a conspiracy theorist in terms of like, oh, the Hurt Syndicate, they don't want to do business. Like, I think it's just a push. We'll see. Maybe that changes over time, but I'm not nearly as concerned about that as some other people. But I think part of the reason the Hurt Syndicate have been getting some heat from fans is because, from an in-ring perspective, their performances have been not up to par, and people are frustrated by that.
Well, the problem is Shelton's singles performances initially they're some of the best work he's done since probably like his youth, and people were really excited. And then the tag stuff has just fallen flat. And I think part of it is, and again, how much is this they don't know how to do it or how much they don't want to do it? They need to do a really tricky role, which is they're trying to be the physically dominant tag team champions, but ideally you want to do that in a way where you still have good, at least good, if not great matches, and your opponents come away looking solid in losing. And I mentioned in the past, Samoa Joe, I think in 2004 Ring of Honor did that better than anyone, where he was a very dominant champion, but he was able to find that line where he worked matches in such a way where by the time a match was over, you were like, Joe's the better man, but that other wrestler is also great. And that was a fun match. And that other wrestler put a couple scares into Joe, but I still come away going, Joe definitively won that. He was better. Like it's a tough role, because if you want to be the Ric Flair style champion, where you like get beat on for 80% of the match and then you cheat to win at the end, it's a lot easier to have good matches and be champ, but still make your opponents look good with you winning. Where to be the dominant heel champion, you have to accomplish these three things. You have to come away from all your matches looking like you're just scary as shit, super dominant hombres. You have to try and have good matches, and you have to make your opponents look at least somewhat good in defeat. And the problem with the Hurt Syndicate as a tag team is they accomplish only the first of those three things. And ideally, you want them to do at least two of those, hopefully all three. And yeah, when I watch guys like Jet Speed work them in some of these angles and stuff, they have not found that line either. Again, I don't know, do they not find that line, which I will admit, again, is a real hard line to find, to try and thread that needle, or do they just not want to thread that needle? I don't know. Like that's one of those unknowns.
Yeah, something else I want to point out. Well, first, you mentioned Samoa Joe. And I do want to point this out. I think we can agree that the Death Riders have at least turned a corner in the sense of they have served their purpose as being big bad guys that whoever beats them, which is most likely going to be Hangman Page this weekend, are going to feel like they've really truly accomplished something, not only by winning the world title, but by finally getting the better of Moxley and taking the title off of him, which is all important stuff. So I think they've done that. And I do want to point out, this is a very, very pro Samoa Joe podcast. I do think that the Hurt Business, Moxley's group, the Death Riders, turned a corner as soon as Samoa Joe started getting involved. When Samoa Joe came in and the Ops came in and they feuded with them when they won the trios titles at that show in Boston, which I did happen to be at, I felt like that was a major turning point because it was the first time Death Riders kind of showed a little ass, and it showed where the end game was going to be for this angle, which as monotonous as it's been, as kind of annoying as the constant interference has been, I do think we've gotten to a point where this is now going to be kind of viewed as a successful angle, despite the fact that, yeah, Moxley didn't have had some pretty bad main events in pay-per-views and things like that. And it wasn't necessarily super smooth, but I think at the end of the day, this thing has really turned around in a way that I didn't necessarily expect. It was very frustrating. I did a whole podcast episode earlier this year just talking about how annoyed I was by the Death Riders, with Sarah from Trish and Sarah. But I do think that they've gotten to a much healthier point with them, and that is a major part of, I think, why people feel good about AEW now.
Yeah, I think one thing that's half helped with that is just time, because I feel like initially with the Death Riders, why they were so disappointing is because they had such potential. Because people maybe forget now, people have short memories, how most of us were super excited in the initial weeks of the Death Riders angle. Like there's some people, there's a contingent of fans out there that just hate John Moxley, I think kind of irrationally, but there is a contingent of people like that. But most people were like, the Mox beating Danielson the way he did, the plastic bag angle, all that stuff was shot, it really, was eye grabbing. And the initial story beats they were trying to sell of the Death Riders is about John Moxley feels like AEW has lost its way and he's got a plan to change things, was a really interesting angle that plays into some reality, and it was exciting. And then they did nothing with it. It was very quickly revealed to be, oh, again, another example of AEW having a great initial idea and no follow up, no idea for what to do the next 2 months of, it was just boilerplate heel run-ins. He kept doing these vague promos where he talked about things he was going to change everything. Nothing about the product changed. It was the most plain humdrum heel faction on top run you could imagine. And then he had the kind of crappy stuff with Cope and all that. And I think the thing that's changed is we've now gone on long enough that we've gotten a lot of fans, I think, have forgotten and gotten over the missed potential of the start of the angle. And now we're just focusing on, well, what's it leading to? And it's going to lead to, it looks like, I agree with you, Hangman getting a big, satisfying win at the biggest show of the year. And so we have enough distance from what we could have had that now we can kind of just celebrate what we're going to get from this, which is going to not be nothing. It's going to be something.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it was also like the feud with Cope and the kind of message that it sent. And I was not a huge fan of Danielson getting the title last year. And as good as the match was at Wembley and it was a nice moment and all that stuff, I just thought it was reductive to, like we've had the title now for almost a year around veteran established wrestlers when there are a lot of other people on the roster that I think would make more sense as a champion. I'm glad that it seems like we're getting towards that finish with Moxley giving up the title to a younger wrestler. And there's also things like this Moxley group was a spinoff of the Blackpool Combat Club, and the Blackpool Combat Club dates all the way back to like William Regal being in the company. It's been going around for a long time, which is another factor I think that's weighed heavily on it. Um, but I think at the end of the day, it's going to do the job. The other thing I want to point out, twofold, and again, I think something that's really important, both in getting AEW's momentum going again, and also kind of in contrast to WWE, its biggest competitor, is two major weaknesses that we heard from day one of this company, which was one was the women's division isn't very good, was definitely the case when the company first started. The other thing was there's not a lot of diversity on this roster, which was also definitely the case when the company first started. And two things are definitely true now, which is that I think the company has done a way better job finding, signing, and developing and promoting people of different color on the show. And the women's division is also way better. And also, the women are being allowed to be presented in a way that they're not really being presented in WWE. And I think those are two huge bonuses. We spent a lot of time talking about the main event picture and who the core four young guys are. But a major part of, I think, the reason these pay-per-views now feel so good and that these shows each week are getting such good reviews, both Dynamite and Collision, is because the depth of the roster is much greater. And that is a huge reason of that is that the women's division is now a strong part of the show, a key part of the show. The Mercedes Moné versus Tony Storm match is one of the biggest matches on All In. It's one of the biggest matches really AEW is going to produce all year, I think. And the Tony Storm Mariah May Hollywood ending match is, in a lot of people's opinion, probably the best match AEW's had this year. So it's no longer this weakness, it's strength. And I think the same can be said for a lot of the diversity. I know people don't necessarily want to hear two white guys talk about diversity on the wrestling show, but it's definitely way different than it was on day one. And I think that AEW deserves a lot of credit for getting both of the aspects that were weaknesses and I think really turning them into strengths in recent years, weeks. Even you talk about like the whole Arena Mexico show and how that show just came across as an earnest embrace and celebration of lucha libre in Mexican American wrestling. and in a way that WWE, just in its atmosphere, which did it's very similar, tried to do a similar show just a week earlier, and it just came across as so sterilized and fake. And how much love was in the AEW show. And I think that stuff does just go a long way in sending a really positive message out to the fan base, and it makes everyone feel better about the company.
First, I don't think there was few things I felt as it was just this is going to be kind of sad that I've been more few more satisfying experiences I've had in the year of our Lord 2025 this year than seeing so many of the worst faith, most awful gremlin goblin people online during Grand Slam Mexico being like, oh God, why is Hangman cutting a promo in Mexican to start, Spanish to start the show? No one's going to know that shit. Why is there so many of these matches with no story and these wrestlers they won't know? Where's the video package? All that. And then it does one of the best rating success stories AEW has had in the last couple of years. It's like, fuck you. Like, that was one of the most satisfying kind of, like, a lot of times in life, you don't get people rebuffed in such a uncounterable, clear, you're wrong as that rating came in. And I was so happy with that. But talking about diversity, I think something, Mercedes signing has done really good for AEW is just allowing women to be focused a little more, at least on the pay-per-views, if not TV. Like there's this great thing from it was when I forget his name now. God, the African American comedian now says awful things about trans people.
Dave Chappelle.
Yeah, Dave Chappelle, of course. Yeah.
It really
Dave Chappelle.
just needed that one hint to tell you exactly who it was.
Well, the hat fits. You get to wear that scarlet letter now, so he deserves it. Anyway, but Dave Chappelle years ago he got I think like the Mark Twain Prize for comedy, and Neil Brennan, who was his co-creator of the Chappelle Show, he was one of the speakers, and there's this great little speech and story he tells where he tells this story of when they were shopping around the Chappelle Show to different places. They went to HBO, and at this time, HBO had the Chris Rock Show on HBO, a talk show Chris Rock had, and Neil Brennan tells the story on stage where he goes, HBO told us, he says, I shit you not, this is the truth. They said, why would we give Dave Chappelle a show when we already have Chris Rock? And they cut to Chris Rock in the crowd upon hearing the story, and Chris Rock just looks so embarrassed, like, I can't believe people on HBO said that. And then Neil Brennan has this great line where he goes, see, back then, only one black comedian was allowed to be famous at a time. Now 3 can be. And I feel like the thing Mercedes allowed AEW to be, it used to be like, you can only have like one good, really heavily pushed women's match on AEW pay-per-view. But with Mercedes, now you get 2. So I feel like that, I mean, that's still, if we're talking about complete gender equality, we're still a long ways away, but that's doubled. I mean, if nothing else, like that alone, it's almost like the Rousey thing with WWE, right? Where WWE did not just start to shift away from the diva treatment of women's wrestling and start to push women more as serious wrestlers and give them a little more time out of the goodness of their hearts. They saw Ronda Rousey in the UFC prove that there was a market for that. A lot of people wanted to spend money to see badass women fighting. They got the opportunity to sign her, and they were like, well, now we have to change the way we do women's wrestling to justify. In kind of a similar way, signing as big a women's star as Mercedes kind of forced them, AEW, to have like 2 women's titles that both have to get some, they have 2 stars now in Tony and Mercedes that kind of demand a significant time and attention. And it's kind of forced AEW to do a little more with women. Again, I still feel like I said way early in the show, I still think the big 2, they need to find a way to elevate a couple people to have the women have their own big 4. I think Willow Nightingale, she's been ready for a long time, and I think they need to put their foot all the way in the water. They need to stop dipping their toe in, and there's so many other great women right now in the division. Like, throw a stone, just pick one, whether it's Statlander or whether it's, Queen Aminata or a million others, just pick one and go with it.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting, and I think that's true for, I think just in general, the women's division just has a lot more depth to it. We're not that far removed from the days where like Soraya was brought in as a big signing. Uh,
Yeah, yeah.
and then you look at, this is easily the best the women's division has been in if AEW's existence, and I would go as far as to say it's, I think among the American promotions, it's the best women's division in the world in terms of the depth and talent, because you have Tony and Mercedes up on top, which are your clear top two stars. And you said maybe you want to get that to a top four. And I do think once you kind of get it, we get away from, the Mercedes Tony feud, which is obviously both two names being very protected, all setting up for this really big match. Once we're kind of over with that, we can start seeing Willow is, I think, obviously the next person in line, but they've done a good job with Megan Bayne. They've done a good job with Mina Shirakawa. They still have Statlander around. They just signed Thekla. You're seeing people like Queen Aminata get some more run. You're seeing more stuff come together. They've signed some people. They developed some people. They are kind of introducing new people. It's a much more exciting time, and ultimately, like if we go back to 2019, 2020, people would say, "Oh, the women's division, they need more matches. Women need more time." And I just as a on to my honest thought as a wrestling fan was, I was like, I understand why people are advocating for this, but I just these are almost always the worst matches on the show. It's just the talent level isn't there. That excuse isn't there anymore. The talent level is there, and I do think we're seeing more and more development. Um, in a positive direction, even though there's still more steps that can be taken. And I think that also has helped the company a lot. And I think the vibes are up because you no longer have. I talked about dead weight, and I would say like there was a time where like the entire women's division almost felt like dead weight, where it was like, oh, here comes the mandatory 9:30 or 9:25 Eastern time women's match. It's probably gonna be the worst match on the show. That has not been the case for a long time now, and I think that's overall reflected and helped the company get to another level from a vibes perspective.
Yeah, and it is kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy when you look at it. But I completely understand. Like, I think sometimes, a lot of times in history, the women's matches have been, not just in AEW, but like the women's matches in US wrestling have been the worst matches on the show and below the median level of the roster on a lot of companies. Not always, but sometimes. But it's one of those things where you never give them time, you never give them attention, you never give them ring experience and ring time, and then they don't approve, and you don't have a robust roster of women to work with, and then you go, well, we can't push them because they don't reach our level, but we're going to give them no resources to improve and build fan bases and get better and reach that level. Like, I do a podcast about old Ring of Honor, and something me and Matt Forrestine, my co-host, we've seen so much is Ring of Honor was so ahead of the curve in so many aspects of wrestling. But one thing they were so retrograde on was how they treated women and how they treated women's wrestling. And we've documented how horrible they treated women in the first years of the company. And we've gotten to a stage where we're covering now, like 5 years in, where women are treated more seriously in the company, but they don't get to wrestle on every show. And it's one match, usually 5 minutes or less, in like the lowest prestige spot on the card, which is second from the bottom. You don't even get the opener. And guess what? Women didn't really develop based on their experience in Ring of Honor. Women's wrestling didn't grow in Ring of Honor. And when women's wrestling, grew more of a fan base, ROH didn't get to capitalize on that. Companies like Shimmer, which kind of had a partnership with ROH, ate their lunch. WWE, took advantage of it.
And for sure.
And mixed martial arts, again, with people like Gina Carano and Ronda Rousey. And it's one of those things where, with stuff like that, it is kind of a, if you build it, they will come kind of thing. Like, you can't just say, well, the women are never going to get there. You have to invest and go, this will pay dividends. One, it'll pay the moral dividend of, it's not good to malign half of the population and treat them as second class. But if you just want to go from the craven business thing, it's like, if we develop women and raise the standard, there are going to be more fans. There are plenty of people that watch women who have watched, even though they're the minority, but there are plenty of women that watch wrestling, even in the years where women were way more maligned in wrestling and served wrongly than they are now, and that they enjoyed it, but you have to imagine there's always going to be more people that watch wrestling if there's someone that is talented, that is entertaining, that is pushed. that looks like them that they can relate to on that level. And so there's like a material benefit to just trying to strengthen women's divisions, and you get there's just a lot of benefits, like from morally and business wise. And so it's one of those things where it's like, I have agreed at times when I watch these shows where it's like when people are like, there should be 4 women's matches on this show, and there's been years ago where I'd be like, well, that would greatly lower the quality of the show. But then the other half of my brain is like, well, how's this ever going to change if you don't, again, invest in these people, try and develop them? How much harder is it for women to get better at wrestling when they have so like fewer opportunities than men, like at all levels of the business? And granted, I will say, in my lifetime, there's been huge strides made, like huge. When I was a kid, women's divisions, if they existed, were like one woman and the challenger of the day. And then a few years later, as I got older, it was pudding matches. Like we've progressed far from there. So I don't want to not give credit and not say we haven't come a long way.
No, I think it's been a long time coming, specifically for AEW, because I mean, we talked about this. I talked about this all the time at the beginning of the company, which was like when people would criticize the women's division, and it'd be like, there's a shortage of talent available, especially when we're talking about like the early idea was is like we'll sign some green independent women's wrestlers. We'll also have these veteran wrestlers coming from Japan, and they will kind of be able to balance things out. So we'll have the veteran wrestlers, and we'll get some of these American wrestlers over, and that's how we're going to kind of piece this thing together. The pandemic happens, so you lose your veteran wrestlers from Japan, with the exception of Shida, who relocated to the United States, and it just kind of really delayed everything. And then eventually people became available. You got people over. Thankfully, WWE didn't know what they had with Tony Storm. It didn't know what, let Mercedes Moné walk, and you got these kind of things to work with. But it took a long time, but it's a feather in I think Tony and everyone associated in AEW's cap that you've gotten the women's division to the degree that where it is now, where you can have some really exciting matchups that are on the same level as the top matchups that the men are having, which is something that was just completely inconceivable when the company first started. And that's a major part of the positivity of this company. As we kind of wrap this up here, people probably listened to this before All In, but obviously we have this Adam Page versus Jon Moxley match happening, and my thoughts are they're going to do a match where like 10 million people are going to run in, and I think Hangman Page is going to go over. I think the way they positioned this is they've kind of set up kind of every heel is kind of aligned with Moxley's group in some way, and there's a bunch of baby faces on Hangman's side, so it's gonna be like one after another, guys running out and doing things, and eventually it's gonna come down to Page beating Jon Moxley, which I think is the right decision. I think there's this idea that like, oh well, it'll be great because anytime there's a logical finish out there where a babyface would be getting really over, there's always that one person that's like, oh, but there'd be great heat if the babyface doesn't win. Hopefully, I think that one of the things Tony has learned over these 6 years, as we've discussed throughout this pod, things Tony has learned. One of them is you don't always have tomorrow to do something. We have seen plenty of times where Tony has held off on delivering certain matchups or delivering certain results, and he waited, and things have been derailed by injuries, people getting suspended, people quitting the company, guys cooling off, things just not working out. It's happened a lot, okay? Kenny Omega and Bryan Danielson had that great 30-minute draw. Like Danielson, I think it was Danielson's first match in the company. Oh my gosh, what a match. And what did everyone say after that draw? Man, it's going to be great when these guys wrestle again. What happened? Kenny Omega missed a bunch of time when he was injured with injuries, and Bryan Danielson then retired. And we never got that match. Now, we could still get that down the line, but we never got it. CM Punk, he had some big matches. He wrestled MJF, he wrestled Jon Moxley, he wrestled Hangman Page. He also didn't get to wrestle a lot of people that people thought he was going to wrestle, largely because what happened? He melted down and he quit the company and he got fired. So like there's one of the lessons that I hope Tony has learned is that there is a time to do things, and you often don't gain anything by waiting. And in fact, you put everything at tremendous risk. So that is my decision. take on that match? Obviously, we'll see how things play out on the show, but what are your thoughts kind of on that main event?
Um, I absolutely agree. I think Hangman has to win this. I can't, and I think it's because I think a lot of people are coming this from the angle of, you know, you don't want to miss the moment on Hangman. You don't want him to come up short after he's got such momentum, and you've really made this feel like it's a big, moment for him to kind of finish, climb back to the top of the mountain again after all this time. But I think there's another reason, and I talk about all the things, the ways I wish AEW would be less like WWE, but there are things you can also take that, you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And one, I think, is a lesson that WWE knew very early on, and they've kind of deviated now with multiple nights of WrestleMania, which is your biggest show of the year that's potentially getting your biggest pay-per-view audience of the year. You want to leave the fans go happy. You want that to be a cathartic moment in the main event. You want people to feel like they've seen the culmination of something, not the start of something that's going to be coming out lasting for another 6 months. Like, you want that. You can have some of those on the undercard, but I think like All In, if it's they're trying to make this their biggest show of the year annually, and they've been doing a fairly good job of that. I think you want to have at the end of those years, the end of those shows, feel good. Everyone goes home happy. The good guy won. A big monumental thing happened endings. And, Tony Storm, if she beats Mercedes, I don't think it's going to rise to that level. And vibes is an overused word these days. I think the vibes would be, no matter what they did, even if there was like a big turn, even if Swerve costed, I think there's no fantasy book way I can do it in my head that would not leave the vibes feeling really bad if you ended All In front of like whatever 25,000 people on a bummer John Moxley wins again ending. Like, there's no way. I've tried as an intellectual exercise of like, is there a fantasy booking way I can do it where I could make myself think that'd be okay, the fans would accept that, and there are ways that are better than other ways, but there's no way where I go that would work. Like, I just don't see it. And I know some people disagree. I know some people think, well, there is a way you could do it. I don't think there is. I think I kind of feel like it would be an undisputable stepping on a rake if Hangman doesn't win this at All In.
Yeah, the argument would be that Tony has some like Gato circa 2017 grand idea where it's going to be so big when Hangman eventually wins the title in like a year from now, and this is all just a step onto that journey. But I just don't see that really any upside to him losing, and I see like a huge downside for him if he does lose, as
And
opposed
the
to like,
go on.
what's the risk? Like, there's zero risk of him winning. Like, when he wins, what's the worst thing that could possibly happen? Like, he's not a good champion. He can move the title on to somebody else if that's the case. That just seems unlikely. Like, this is your big show. You want to send the fans home happy. You want to send the fans home happy. And also, it's something that WWE doesn't always do. They sometimes do weird finishes, and they love their heat. So I think it's something that'd be kind of also different. To really, again, this is a company that listens to its fans and gives them what they want, and clearly they want the Hangman and they want him now.
Yeah, and I think the one argument people have had, or the reason at least why they've doubted that it could happen, is because it definitely seemed like one of the big ideas was Darby's going to climb Everest, and when he comes back, he's going to get revenge on Mox, and he's going to defeat. And they had in the past, Mox even kind of allude to it, where like, he cut some kind of promo where he alluded to like, to beat me, you're going to need someone that climbs mountains, or like it was something where he was clearly hinting at the idea that the one guy that could beat him was Darby Allin, but plans change, sometimes, and I think, I'm not saying you shouldn't push Darby Allin or shouldn't have a Darby Allin Mox feud, or that even that initial idea wasn't good, but times have changed. And I think right now, if you tried to have Darby win, I think too many fans would resent Darby for that. That would be more like the last 20 years of WWE booking. That'd be like, we insist on something, even though the fans clearly kind of want something a little bit more. Not that they hate Darby, but it's one of those things where I think you could get some of those fans to start resenting Darby, because now you're going to start pitting Darby fans against Hangman fans, and Hangman fans, of which I'm one. I'm not one of the most militant ones, but they are an ornery bunch that are very protective of their special little guy, and they're it would not be good. Like, it wouldn't be good for Darby. Like, if I'm Darby, if Tony came up to me like, we're gonna stick with the plan, Hangman's gonna lose and you're gonna win, I'd be like, I don't want this. This won't be good for me. Like, don't do this,
Yeah,
please.
he's gonna be Rey Mysterio coming out as number 30 in the Royal Rumble. Like, no one really
Exactly.
wants to boo Darby Allin, but
Yeah,
they
you're the
might
sim.
if he's not who they want.
But the other thing I wanted to say is, you mentioned, like, the one thing you could get is that Gato style booking of a guy loses big, and that sets up like the even bigger rematch down the line. And in a way, you could say WWE kind of, lucked into it, or maybe where a lot of us, me especially, thought it was a horrible idea to have go against momentum and have Cody lose to Roman at WrestleMania, but through like a weird series, like almost like a Rube Goldberg like style machine of different consequences, the second year it did feel bigger when Cody won the second year. I don't think that would work for Hangman, but more than that, I think they already have the Gato style babyface suffers heartbreaking loss and is set up for a win the next year. They just started it at Double or Nothing because I think a lot of us thought Ospreay was going to beat Hangman and beat the guy in Hangman's position right now, All In. And then they did that whole thing where Ospreay was so confident going in, he loses clean. He doesn't turn heel. He's clearly heartbroken. And now it feels like they're kind of setting it with this stip of Swerve and Ospreay. If they lose, they can't challenge for the world title for a year. Well, what's going to be 1 year from All In? It's going to be All In again in it back in Wembley. And it's like, to me, it feels like we're on a path now of the time for Ospreay will be him finally winning the world title as soon as that ban expires in Wembley, all in 2026, which again, that is great Gato style booking. I think they're on the road to that, just with a different
Yeah.
wrestler.
I think that's with that match, that stipulation. I think it's just like, even if they don't do it, even if Osprey and Swerve win, it's a great idea for a stipulation because it makes people believe that they are going to potentially lose because it's such a good stipulation that because people can see that vision, right?
Yeah.
That
And the fact
you're
they
gonna
did that with Cody and they stuck to it until he left, it does give them some credibility of like, if we do this stipulation, not only could it come true, we will stick to it.
Yeah, that's really key because everyone can see their vision, the vision, right? It's going to be Osprey and Swerve are going to be super mad at each other for costing themselves, specifically Swerve mad at Osprey for putting that on the line, and then they probably like meet in the finals of the Owen next year with the first time they can challenge for the title in a year on the line,
Yeah.
and then you can whoever is the champ at the time, it doesn't, maybe it's still Hangman, maybe it's not. Um, it's a real opportunity because obviously, like, I think if you're plotting out your world championship reigns, I think it has to be, like you said, those four guys that we're talking about. It's got to be Hangman, it's got to be Swerve, it's got to be Osprey, and it's got to be MJF. And there's probably not a lot of room for anybody else over the next few years. Unless,
Yeah.
you want to do another nostalgia run with a guy who's in his 40s, which I would not do, but
And again, it doesn't mean you don't cycle in other guys to work. Those guys just can't, this isn't going to be all 90s all Japan where it's the same four guys working each other for a decade.
yeah.
You have all this great roster, including of veteran, really big time stars like Omega, that should cycle in and work matches and keep them busy. But the thought should always be our next 5 years of the company, ideally, if everything goes right, is these guys. Like, this is the meat of their career right now, and everything should be, first priority should be how do we serve them, and then everything else is priority too.
Yeah, and that's good booking. And like you said, so also it helps you avoid that the damaging TNA booking, which is like you said, you bring in somebody and then the company gets built around that fresh new thing, and you kind of forget about the homegrown star that is, synonymous with your brand and also isn't probably just looking for the next to kill some time before they can go back to WWE, which is something that TNA did.
Yeah.
Right? Keeping that mindset that the company is built around these four guys, right? What's the saying? Hangman Page is the main character of AEW, and that needs to always be at the forefront. It doesn't always have to be Hangman Page, but it has to be the guys that you feel like are the key building blocks of your company. And I 100% agree with what you're saying about like One thing I've been consistent about saying, which is like a thing I would like to see AEW do that WWE does, is WWE does a really great job marketing and presenting its absolute top guys like Cody Rhodes, like Roman Reigns, as these like huge legendary figures on each show. And I enjoy the egalitarian approach that AEW presents, where you just get to see a lot of different people and a lot of unique styles, and different guys get to do different things. But there's something to be said for, especially in the wrestling business, having these big individual stars, and that takes a really consistent, renewed uh, message that comes across in your booking and your presentation of these stars that AEW hasn't always hit necessarily. Like there was a lot of criticism of Hangman Page's first world title run that he wasn't on TV enough.
Yeah, it's about, again, having that follow up. And yeah, WWE, sometimes they've gone way too far, in a lot of times way too far in the opposite direction, where they focus on a certain couple people as their top stars, to the point where everyone else seems like nothing in comparison. And you see them so much, sometimes less nowadays, because so many of these big names just have very low date contracts. But there's been the past where it was like, you saw them so much and they were talked about so much during so many segments, you were sick of them. But on the other end of that, WWE has never had a problem with you not knowing that one or two guys stand above everyone else. They've rarely had a problem with that. And they've always made sure you know who you're supposed to see as the top guys. And they've lavished attention and time, on them. And yeah, that is something that AEW, I wouldn't want them to go full blown as far as WWE often goes, but there should be an answer. There should be, when you ask fans, who are the top, like who are the big four, who are the top two, who's the biggest star? Most fans should have similar answers. You want people to have, even if they don't, that's not necessarily their absolute favorite. There should be this vibe of, I know who are the top people. I know who are on that top tier. There should be a top tier. It shouldn't be. And there have been times in AEW where it feels like there's a tier of 15 and 20 guys that kind of are all around the same level, and they take turns on the main events. And again, I think this year they've been better at, it feels like there's a nice group of 4 or 5 on the men. There's a group of 2 women, where it feels like this is the top tier. And I think you reap a lot of benefits from having a more, a firm hierarchy in wrestling of, these are our main eventers, these are our upper mid carders, these are our mid carders, and then when those people like shift and move up, it feels like a bigger deal because you've been a little more rigid about it.
All right, I think we're gonna wrap things up. Trevor, you got anything you want to plug?
Just Through the Years, my podcast, along with the great Matt Feuerstein. ThROH is how we spell through, so that way if you want to search for it, if you search for it the other way, I don't know, you might get, I think there's an old Kenny Rogers song called Through the Years, but if you spell it our way, all you will get is results about our podcast, and apparently there is a Pokemon named ThROH. I did not know that till I started doing this podcast, but it's a best thing I do. It's a podcast about the early days of ROH. We've been doing it for over 8 years. We've got like over 140 something episodes. We did like a 6-hour Bryan Danielson special, because he's our special little guy. And yeah, just that. Trevor Dame on Twitter. I'm also on Blue Sky. Search for that too. You'll find me easily. And yeah, that's everything.
All right. I want to thank Trevor for joining the show. I want to thank all our listeners for tuning in, and I'll talk to you all again after a while. Bye-bye.
Hello, everyone. My name is Taylor.
And I'm Kelly.
And we are the co-hosts of Jumping Bomb Audio, the #1 show all about the world of Joshi Pro Wrestling. Every other Monday, we're coming at you with news, show reviews, and previews of upcoming Joshi action.
So whether you're just getting into the scene or you've seen it all, this is the show for you.
Check us out on the Voices of Wrestling podcast network and wherever you get your audio.
Do you like wrestling trivia? Then check out the 5-Star Match Game, the Pro Wrestling Quiz Show. I'm Joe Gagney, and every episode, I grill 3 contestants with 5 rounds of power-packed wrestling trivia. We have over 30 evergreen episodes in the archives covering WWE, AEW, Japan, Mexico, and much, 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 much more. Play along at home and check it out today.